Right. Parshas Vaera, tonight's Shia has been dedicated to Yetzer Hara, Pesach Eiliyahu ben Ravon Tzvi Zatzal, whose yahrzeit is Chof Gimel Teves. If you wish to sponsor a future Shia, please be in touch. We continue Sefer Shemois with Parshas Vaera, in which most of the Makkahs take place. And my opening question this week, Rabbi Sai, is what are 5 lessons that we can learn from the conduct of Paroi that is relevant to our lives? And as an introduction, as a Akdoma, I first wish to explain why I'm obsessed with Paroi. Who cares about Paroi? Why is there something that we need to learn? So, as you know, I've said many times here, but I saw this week actually from the Zohar that Torah is Miloshen Hara. Torah is there to instruct us on how to live life. So every part of Torah is worthwhile learning so that we have that level of instruction. But specifically regarding Paroi, there is a statement which the Rambam made in a letter that he wrote to his son. And he writes in the Geras Rambam to his son, Ki Paroi melech Mitzrayim hu Yetzer Hara be'emes. Paroi, the king of Mitzrayim, is truly the Yetzer Hara inside all of us. So what's clear then is the importance of learning about Paroi is because by learning about Paroi we get insight into how the Yetzer Hara operates, because there's so much similarity between them. And once you have understanding of how the Yetzer Hara operates, you can then be more empowered to actually fight the Yetzer Hara. Which is why I wish to draw 5 lessons from Paroi's conduct that we can glean from this week's Sedra, which will reflect on the Yetzer Hara's approach to fighting us, and thereby give us the understanding and the power we need to fight the Yetzer Hara on its terms. So the first and perhaps most obvious lesson that's available to us from observing Paroi is one that the Mesilas Yesharim makes in Perek Beis, when the Mesilas Yesharim is talking about the midah of Zehirus. And the Mesilas Yesharim is making the case that in order for a person to be successful in their service of Hashem and Avodas Hashem, a person has to have space for reflection. A person must give themselves adequate space in order to then be able to grow. And something, this is something that Paroi did not allow for the Yidden to have. As we read in last week's Sedra, the Mesilas Yesharim quotes, Paroi said, Tichbad avoda anoshim, that the work should be made harder for the men. Says the Mesilas Yesharim, Shoy miskaven shloi la'aniach lehem revach klal, levilti yitnu leiv v'yisimu eitz negdei. Paroi's intention was, work them so hard, they won't have any space whatsoever to mount any kind of rebellion against me. That was Paroi's calculation. Says in Mesilas Yesharim, Kein hi atzas hayetzer hara mamish al bnei odom. It's exactly the same tactic that Yetzer Hara tries to use on people. He wants us to be busy. The Yetzer Hara wants us to be so busy that we simply don't have time to reflect, time to pause, time to consider, and time to change, take a different course. So if you were looking for the first lesson and the first clear antidote that we can glean from Paroi and from the Sedra, it is give yourself some space, give yourself some meaningful time to reflect. And by doing so, you'll be in a better position to consider what's going on in your life, consider your options, and realize what course of action to take. But that's in terms of looking at what Paroi made as a decision and learning from that. But let's look at Paroi as the person. And let's draw a few lessons from that. So first of all, weirdly, Paroi believed himself to be a god. The Pasuk in Yechezkel HaNavi tells us, Chof Tes Gimel, Asher Omar li yo'ori v'ani asisini. Paroi said, the Yo'or, the Nile is mine, and I made it. As a kid, we may have heard this type of medrash, this type of chazal. Paroi said he was a god. It's an absolutely crazy thing. That Paroi held himself as a god, not only just for the name, I'm in charge, but claiming that he created the Nile. I mean, have you heard something more ridiculous than that? But it's not just ridiculous, it's an egotistical, haughty approach of Paroi. It's gaiva. Puffing his chest and taking credit for that which is not his. Ultimate gaiva. And you know how far this goes? Unbelievable. Beginning of this week's Hedra, after Moshe Rabbeinu spoke again to the Yidden, he got a bit of a cold reception. If you remember last week's Hedra, when Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the Yidden, Vayam Enam, everyone believed. And then Paroi made it worse for everyone. We just said, Tichbad Avodah Anoshim, Paroi made it worse. And now Moshe Rabbeinu comes back to the Yidden, and Pasuk tells us, V'lo Shamu el Moshe. Mikotzer Ruach Maveda Kosher. They couldn't listen to Moshe because of the shortness of breath and because of the work that they were so engaged in. And Moshe Rabbeinu, Chazal tells us, Rashi brings it, Moshe Rabbeinu turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if one can say, with slight frustration, with a kal v'chomer. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to Hashem, how is this supposed to work? If the Yidden already didn't listen to me, how's Paroi going to listen to me? That was Moshe Rabbeinu's kal v'chomer. And all the Mefarshim ask, it's not really fair comparison. The Yidden had a mitigating factor. They were working very hard. So they didn't really have the capacity to hear Moshe again. V'lo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach me'avodah kosher. They were under severe strain, so that's why they couldn't listen to Moshe. Paroi doesn't have that disadvantage. So how is Moshe Rabbeinu comparing? If the Yidden didn't listen to me, how could Paroi listen to me? Paroi doesn't have the disadvantage that the Yidden had. This is all the Mefarshim ask this question. But Reb Leib Chasman explains, Kisheyesh midois rois v'gaiva v'irotzoin lehiskoifef b'fnei ha'emes. When a person has the perfect cocktail of midas rois, gaiva, haughtiness, the inability to be humble, and the absence of a will to bend oneself to truth, says Rav Leib Chasman, ze yoiser koitzer ruach v'avodah kosher me'asher shibo titu leveinim. It is harder for that person in terms of the effect that it has on them, that they are metaphorically short of breath and suffering from hard work, more than if they would be suffering from that physically. You realize what's being said here? Paroi was at a disadvantage. True, he wasn't physically in labor like the rest of Klal Yisrael were. But Paroi's gaiva, Paroi's midas rois, was so tough, was so embedded, that it was hard for him to see beyond his nose. In the same way, if not worse, like Klal Yisrael couldn't consider what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying because they were inhibited by the hard work physically, Paroi was inhibited because of the midas rois and gaiva that he carried. So if we're looking to understand Paroi as a person, then we've just identified the first and most obvious point about Paroi. Paroi was Mr. Haughty. Paroi was Bal Gaiva. And it's his Gaiva that didn't allow for him to consider what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, to consider letting the Yidden go out of Mitzrayim. After the Makkah of Dam hit Paroi where it hurts, because it hit the Nile. Turned the whole Nile into blood. Pasuk tells us, Zayin Chav Gimel, V'loi shos liboy gam lo zois. Paroi did not take any notice also of this. Aside from the previous signs that Moshe Rabbeinu had shown him, Makkah of Dam transpired, and Paroi took no notice. So Paroi was ignoring the reality that was in front of his eyes. Remember, Paroi claimed to be the God. Paroi claimed to be the one to have created the Nile, not least to be the one in control of the Nile. And it turns into blood in front of his eyes, which is, if you want any type of credibility to be destroyed, it's right there. Paroi's winning, Paroi's whole strategy is to say, oh, he's the great big master, he's in charge. And yet, right in front of him, the very thing that he's claiming to have been created and be in control of is completely taken away from him, and clearly Hashem is in control. It ought to have wrecked any credibility that Paroi could have had to pull off this stunt of saying he's some sort of deity. Any normal person surely would have been embarrassed to continue this charade. Paroi's not bothered. V'loi shos libo gam lo zois. Passed right over him. As one of the Gedolim reportedly said, anyone can do tshuva except the shakran. The guy who's incapable of seeing truth, the guy who's not able to be brutally honest with themselves, there is no chance for them to grow, to change. And the Alter Slabodka says that this inability of Paro to see the truth for what it was in front of his face was apparent right from the beginning. When Moshe and Aaron first appeared in front of Paro, he didn't just disregard them and mock them, he mocked Hashem. He said, "Me Hashem, don't find him in my book." Have you ever considered, how did Moshe and Aaron get into Paro's palace? The Medrash describes, Alter Vodka brings the Medrash, it describes, as we know, Paro was the most powerful ruler, the most powerful nation in the world at the time. He had a palace apparently with 400 entrances. And each entrance had guards and soldiers and wild animals. So you can imagine the security apparatus was pretty strong. And Moshe and Aaron saunter into his private residence, have an audience with the king as if it's the most normal thing in the world. To the first question, anyone who's experiencing visitors that have bypassed all his security measures, anyone normal would have at that point gone, "How do you guys get in here?" And maybe even after having that thought, considered, well, they look like righteous people. Medrash describes them as the shemesh, the rays of sun was shining on their face. Clearly they were special people. There's something superhuman, something supernatural going on here. Maybe there's pause, for consideration. This is the background before they even open their mouth. No, not Paro. Completely passes him by. Doesn't ask the question, doesn't even get curious about it, not bothered. Listens to them, mocks them, Mi Hashem. Incredible. The Alter Slabotka writes, Kein hu hadova. Yesh le'odom koyach godol kozeh. Koyach ra shel hachosha. A person has the ability to be in denial. It is an ability that a person has. He can choose to completely ignore the realities in front of them. At that very moment where Paro could see the incredible greatness of Hashem with the visit of Moshe and Aaron, as we've said, with all that he could just ignore it, let it pass by. So in the interest of us drawing from Paro an understanding about how the Yetzer Hara works, in looking at Paro and understanding, first of all, his gaiva, and second of all, the ability of him to be in denial, for him to ignore the truth and live with his nose in the air as if everything's fine and dandy. That's something that is apparent in the way the Yetzer Hara deals with us as well. And the Yetzer Hara gives us boosts to our ego. He wants us to feel haughty, he wants us to feel in control, he wants us to minimize, so to speak, our recognition of Hashem being in charge. And then when we are confronted with the realities of life, when a person who wants to, who is humble enough, can see truth, staring him in the face and pause for thought and pause for correctness, the Yetzer Hara wants us to ignore all that and to just bypass it. So, never happened. After Makkah of Kinim, even the magicians in Mitzrayim had to admit defeat. They recognized something here was unique. They couldn't copy the Makkah. And what did they exclaim? They said, Etzba Elohimhi, the finger of Hashem. So Yaakov Galinsky says, Amoyudika moshel, little moshel. You have children playing around on the first floor of a building, fooling around, hide and seek, whatever it is, doing their game. And one of them notices the window at the far end of the room, there's some fingers that have become apparent on the windowsill. So the kid turns to his friend and says, "Hey, someone's on the windowsill. Says Ran Kalinsky, why doesn't the kid say, "Hey, there's some fingers on the windowsill"? Because everyone understands if you see a finger, there's somebody that finger usually belongs to. Even a kid understands that. You see fingers, you know there's someone there. The Mitzrayim, Etzba Likimi. It's an Etzba, little finger. They saw the finger. They didn't see the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's like when you ask someone for directions and they point with their arm and they go over there. And instead of looking where they're pointing to, you look at their finger. You say, where? Where? Even when they were forced to recognize Hashem, they were still limited in their recognition of Hashem. That's how far it went. And that's what the Yetzer Hara wants us to do in our daily life as well. He wants us to not see the big picture. Don't see the sign of what it represents in bigger terms. You see a little Ma'aseh Hashgacha, no! See something happen which could be an opportunity for you to gain in your understanding of Hashem, of wisdom of Torah. And the Yetzer Hara wants us to make nothing out of it. Nah. And there's another lesson we can learn from Paroi. And this is that the reality of life is that the choices that a person makes which are righteous will often take a while, and some cases a lifetime, until they are shown to be worth it. Whereas when someone makes the wrong choice, sometimes there's an immediate pleasure which they receive. And I'll explain what I mean. When a person wants to grow in spirituality, a person wants to grow in Ruchni, a person wants to grow in Avodas Hashem, there's a certain amount of patience and a certain amount of resilience that's required. Because things don't turn around overnight, people don't grow overnight, and you need to stick the course. Because in the end, if you choose to do the right thing, even if in the moment it appears shaky or it doesn't feel as good as you might have wanted it to feel, but ultimately, at some point, and it might only be in the next world, the course will take you to the point where you will realize the righteous choice was the right choice. Because to build takes time. To destroy takes seconds. You have a beautiful building. Imagine the years that it took to go through all the planning, especially in the UK. The planning and the designing and the building. Until you get 10 years down the line, you've got this most beautiful building. And in a few minutes, the whole thing goes up in smoke. Look at this. Contrast Moshe Rabbeinu with Paroi for a second. Look at the leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu. Hashem comes to Moshe Rabbeinu with a mission. And says, go to Paroi, let him send the Yidden out. How did it go for him? He turns up to Paroi, we just said. He mocked him, chucked him out, ignored him, not relevant. He goes to the Yidden. True, the first time he went to the Yidden, Vayaminam, the Yidden believed, and was to their credit. The Yidden showed the Gewaldige Emunah, it's true. But as we said at the beginning of this week's Sedra, they came back to the Yidden to continue the conversation, but Hashem and Moshe, they weren't there. And Fakir, they got upset with Moshe Rabbeinu because after Moshe Rabbeinu had gone to Paroi last time, Paroi turned out making the work even harder for them. The pressure on Moshe Rabbeinu was so immense that he turned to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he says, what are you sending me this mission for? This is absolutely a path to nowhere. And he was criticized for it. Hashem wasn't unhappy with him. So don't question my thing. Avraham, if you never question me, why are you questioning me? But in the immediate path of Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership, it appears to have been very shaky. And yet with time, Moshe Rabbeinu is the quintessential leader of Klal Yisrael, took us through the Midbar, fought for us against the different decrees that HaKadosh Baruch Hu at different points wanted to punish us with. He led us through Kabbalah Satira, through the Midbar. He's the only leader besides Rebbe HaKadosh who we call Rabbeinu. So I ask you, over the course of life, over the course of time, was Moshe Rabbeinu a success? Of course. When he started out, those first few months, do you think he felt it was a success? Look at Paroi. Paroi, Mr. Powerful. Paroi, the most powerful guy in the world, sat on his throne. Even if he was only one amma high, as the Midrashim say, he still had the power. People were terrified of him. He had so much power that he could be shown to be wrong with the Nile not belonging under his control, and it didn't make a difference in his authority. He still kept being in control of Mitzrayim. He was Mr. Powerful. No one messed with him. Makkah after Makkah after Makkah, he was a strong leader. He was a tough guy. He was holding out. What did it look like in the short term? Who had the upper hand? Who was doing well? Well, even though his country was falling apart, Paro was still doing fine. How did it end up for Paro? I want to read to you a paragraph from Rabbi Pini Dunna. Some of you may have heard of him in America. He so eloquently describes the scene of Paro standing by the Yam Suf. I want to read to you what he writes. He writes like this: his entire army had been obliterated. His state-of-the-art war chariots lay shattered like broken toys, strewn among the lifeless body of his soldiers. And he was left utterly alone, defeated, humiliated, stripped of everything. Some say, Chazal tell us, he wandered off and eventually became the king of Nineveh, where in the story of Yonah he had finally learned his lesson, and immediately did tshuva, the first warning of Yonah. The image is striking. Paro standing alone on the shore, watching as the remnants of his once mighty army washed up as lifeless corpses around him. The chariots that once symbolized his military dominance now lay around him, shattered and useless. If only he had admitted reality earlier, if only he had understood that his so-called strength, his stubborn refusal to surrender, was in fact his ultimate downfall. Rabbi said the Yetzer Hara loves to make the path in front of us that isn't the right path look glamorous, successful, and feel good in a moment. But it only lasts as long as it lasts. The most convenient path for the Yetzer Hara is urgency, a sense of urgency. You've got to decide now. You've got to do it now. Because that's what Yetzer Hara is about. It's short-termism. It's all about now. Forget later. Don't worry about later. It's a mode of Olam Hazeh versus Olam Haba. Olam Hazeh is about now. Olam Haba is having the wisdom to think longer term, to think on balance. Is this really worthwhile? You know, the brilliant example of the Yetzer Hara is sleeping in the morning. So you know what time you want to get up. You've got a day ahead. It's not like a day of holiday where it doesn't actually matter. There's a day ahead, there's program, there's rota, there's whatever it is. And the Yetzer Hara tells you when your alarm goes, sleep another 5 minutes. Classic Yetzer Hara. It's short-termism. It's convincing you it's a great idea because now you get a shluff. But what about the consequences? I'm going to end up either coming late to chakras or going to different chakras, and we know how it can spiral. Yetzer Hara doesn't take any of that into consideration. It's not what's on his agenda. He just cares about now. I'll give you another example because I think it's again so relevant to all of us. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but anyone who has ever spoken Lashon Hara will know that unfortunately there's quite a bit of a geschmack in sharing a piece of juicy Lashon Hara, especially when you could reason to yourself it's not even causing the other guy harm and nothing's even going to come of it, and all the cheshbonis that we make to try and make ourselves feel better about it. But the fact is, when you've got a juicy piece of news which no one else or the person you're telling doesn't know yet, and you can tell it to him, there's a geschmack. There's a geschmack in it, no question. But when you hold yourself back and don't tell him the Lashon Hara, does it feel as good? Of course it doesn't. In fact, when that happens, I'll sometimes keep on hearing the argument in my head of, but go on, tell him. Why is that argument coming back? Because it's not geschmack. Doing the right thing doesn't always feel good in the moment. Yetzer Hara wants you to feel good now. Do it, because it'll make you feel good. What about the longer term? What about the next world? What are we here for? Etc. None of that. Yetzer Hara doesn't want you to think like that. The final lesson, Rabbi Isai, I want to draw from Paro from the Parsha, is, I think, the biggest chizuk yet. And it comes from the Altos Labotka. What was the purpose of the Makkos, Rabbi Isai? Mefarshim discussed the purpose of the Makkos, right? So I was always brought up the idea the Makkos were midah keneged midah, so it was all about punishment of the Mitzrayim. But the Ksara Kabbalah, the Meshech Chochmah, and probably the Ramban and the end of Parshas Vaera as well, make it quite clear that it wasn't that the purpose, although it was part of it, but it wasn't the purpose of the Makkos were the punishments. The midah keneged midah element, that wasn't the purpose. The purpose of the Makkos were to teach the Mitzrayim, to teach the world, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in charge of the world. As we've laid out, Paro was so obsessed with himself being a deity. Paro was so against hearing anything different than him being in charge and him being in the right, that it took makkah after makkah after makkah after makkah for the message to slowly get somewhere into Paro's brain. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in charge. The Rambam at the end of Parshas Vaera is famous for how he points and details the emunah that comes out of the Parsha of the Makkos, and he quotes all the different psukim, Leman Teidak Eni Hashem, Leman Teidak Il Hashem Ha'oretz. All of the Makkos were in order, you should know. Hashem is in charge. Now, some people are quick learners. They have enough humility. You show them a new way of learning, a new way of living, or a new way of correcting their behavior, and they change. But others are more stubborn, and they're fixed in their outlook. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to teach a person a lesson, he'll give them a little patch, sometimes. To teach them a lesson so that they reflect. So use that as a reason to pause, to change course. But with Paroi was very stubborn. He held on stark. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to smash everything and everyone in his path, till we just described, Paroi was the only man left after his whole nation had been destroyed. But says the Altos Labotka, but in the end, Paroi got the message. And Paroi went to the Nineveh, and Paroi changed his approach to life, and tshuva became something he was very comfortable with. Because after all the suffering and after all the punishments, he got the message in the end, Hashem's in charge. It says the Alta, you see from here, and we have to learn from here, that anyone can change. It doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter how set in your ways you are, it doesn't matter what type of midas you have naturally. Anyone can change if you put your mind to it, you're open to it, you're humble enough, you seek the truth, you can fight the Yetzer Hara, and you can change. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed us this with Paroi. It's a remarkable way of looking at this whole story, because I don't think I have looked at it this way before. We all know Paroi for all his chesronos, and there are many. And Paroi was the wicked king, we know that. But the end of the story is that ultimately Hashem brought him to change. And that should teach us that we are able to change as well. So in terms of summarizing and taking away, we wanted to draw 5 lessons from Paroi, from the Parsha, of how to understand and recognize the game that we are in, of fighting the Yetzer Hara, and how the Yetzer Hara operates. So we said, first of all, Paroi never gave any space to reflect. As the Yetzer Hara pointed out, it's the first thing of growth, that a person has to give themselves time to reflect, meaningful reflection. Give yourself space, you're able to grow. The second thing is, you see from Paroi was Mr. Bal Gaiva. Paroi was so haughty, he was incapable of being humble. We learn that's how the Yetzer Hara wants us to be. To fight the Yetzer Hara, seek to be humble. If you seek humility, you'll have an open mind, you'll be able to see where you've gone wrong, you'll be able to correct yourself easier. The next point we said was Paroi lived in denial. And the Yetzer Hara likes it when we live in denial. Even the most apparent lessons that happen in front of us that ought to be lessons for us and we can learn from, sometimes will go straight past us. That's what the Yetzer Hara wants to do. Don't take notice. We have to be able to seek the truth and recognize the truth when it hits us in the face. The next limud we said we learned from Paroi is that doing the right thing is about thinking long term, even if it doesn't feel good in the moment always. But focus on doing the right thing, even if it takes time for it to play out. And the last thing we said was be open to change and realize and recognize and believe that anyone and everyone can change. If even Paroi changed in the end, we can also change, and Hashem wants us to, and Hashem will lead us on a journey until we do. If we seek the right direction, Hashem will help us get there. Shkoyach.